Our next guest is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University. He's based in Jerusalem, and he's an award-winning American presidential historian, as well as a leading Zionist activist. He's the author of several books, including The Zionist Ideas, Moynihan's Moment, and Never Alone. It's my pleasure to welcome our friend, Professor Gil Troy. Gil, thank you so much for being with us.
Always great to be with you, Michael. I'm a big fan of Stand With Us and the important work you're doing.
Thank you. And we're all going through something right now, whether in Israel or around the world. So as a historian, can you put the seriousness of this moment into historical context for us?
Well, of course, we'll be able to do that better in 6 months or a year. But on October 7th, I think we saw a civilizational clash. We saw a defining moment. We saw a moment where evil was unleashed on civilians. And we have a choice. We can either stand up to the challenge of the moment, or we can retreat. And I'm very proud to say that Israel is standing up to the challenge. I'm very proud to say that whether you're Republican or Democrat, when Joe Biden says don't, and sends 2 aircraft carriers and nuclear sub into the area, he's standing up to the challenge. I'm very proud to see that the British Prime Minister, the French Prime Minister has also stood up to the challenge. And that's the macro. On the micro level, every single one of us has to ask the question, at that moment on October 7th, when we woke up and we realized the evil that was being perpetrated on individual citizens, on innocent civilians, do we want to use that moment to redefine our lives? Do we want to use that moment to, as you guys do, stand up and stand with Israel and stand with Western civilization? Or do we try to deny and go back into our bubble? I'm proud to say that most people I know, Jews and non-Jews around the world, have said, wait a minute, this is a wake-up call. We were living in our little bubble, but it's time for us to stand for principle, because if it's in Israel one day, it'll be in London, in Paris, in New York the next day.
Without a doubt. And you wrote recently about the Hamas enablers on the other side who keep conning the world. So what are some of the new big lies that are being propagated around the world?
Look, it's stunning because I'm an academic, so I'm a case of arrested development. I got to the university, never left. And to note that many of these lies are generated and celebrated and perpetrated in the universities is very painful for me. So when they yell, to the river from the sea, Palestine will be free, and they claim, oh, we're just looking for one single democratic state. No, they're saying there'll be no place for you and me, Michael. They're saying there'll be no place for any Jews from the river to the sea. When they talk about decolonization, and even on October 7th, you want to be anti-occupation, that's fine. You want to be anti-Israel, that's fine. But on October 7th, with women being raped, with babies being beheaded, with grandmothers being kidnapped, with people, young and old, being slaughtered, you couldn't stop your ideology for a second and sit with your Jewish friends and non-Jewish friends who care about Israel and say, wait a minute, this is unacceptable? No. You imposed this oppressor notion and said, well, decolonization costs. Or you say, as a Cornell professor said, I'm exhilarated by it. These are big, big lies. And then in the article that I wrote for the LA Jewish Journal, I list 9 of these kind of lies. We talk about how Gaza was occupied. Well, if Gaza was occupied, how come today's New York Times, looking at the extensive tunnels that were developed, talks about the area that was under Hamas's control? How could Hamas have been how could Hamas have been controlling it when in fact it was supposedly being occupied by Israel? Israel withdrew from every last inch of Gaza in 2005. And the Palestinians, this isn't just a Hamas issue, folks. The Palestinians had a choice. They could have either built a Riviera on the Mediterranean, a Riviera of the Middle East, or they could have built the war machine that they did. On Friday, we discovered that the IDF has already targeted 15,000 targets. Do you know what that means? It means that before the disengagement, maybe there were 1,000 or 2,000 targets. Since that time, Hamas has taken all the fuel and all the material and all the manpower and used it just to build this war machine, just to try to destroy civilian life in Israel. And we're at fault? And we're the ones who are disproportionate? And we're the ones lacking in morality? No, siree.
And of course, we remember Western allies prosecuted a war against ISIS. Many other conflicts have raged around the world, and yet we've never seen anything compared to the amount of rage and abuse that's hurled at Israel. So what's the reason for that stark difference?
In American constitutional law, there's a phrase, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. That for all our morality, for all our legality, for all our constitutionalism, at the end of the day, the primary goal of a nation is to protect its citizens. And that is a moral stance. And the moral stance today is for Israel to protect itself, defend itself, and understanding that it's also defending, in a sense, Western civilization. And so when you see the hundreds of thousands of people protesting in London, defiling Armistice Day, I must add, in Paris, in Washington, in Boston, you say, what's going on? And I don't just look at the way the Western world fought ISIS and the over 10,000 people killed in Mosul, which was actually not like Gaza, not a hostile population, but an innocent population that was simply overwhelmed by ISIS, but that was the nature of the fight. I don't just look at the 100,000 people killed in Iraq as the United States of America was trying to save Iraq from Saddam Hussein. I go back to that civilizational conflict, World War II. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt. These were people who wanted to save civilians. These were people who, in many ways, tried to avoid involvement in the war. But once they saw the nature of the conflict, they saw it's them or us. They saw that every time we are engaged in a fight with the Nazis or the Japanese, and I would add with Hamas, any civilian casualty, any wounded person, any loss is their fault because they started. That's one level of morality. The second level of morality is that you have to do everything possible, not just to defend yourself, but to defend Western civilization. And to get to the core of your question, and I hate to say this, but when I see the fury, the anger, the inability to let Israelis defend themselves, and we see what happened on October 7th, in Israel we saw the anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic nature of Hamas's anti-Zionism. And throughout the world, we're seeing the anti-Zionist nature of modern anti-Semitism. And so that silly debate about, is it anti-Semitism, is it anti-Zionism, it's been merged. When they have posters saying, gas the Jews, that has nothing to do with Israel, that has to do with Jews. And when we see the way Jewish women were dehumanized, and the feminists don't even stand up and say, wait a minute, what about Hamas's rape culture? This is unacceptable. We see that the fury against Israel has its origins, I'm sorry to say, in a 3,000-year-old hatred. People like to call it anti-Semitism. I call it Jew hatred because it's an uglier word. It sounds less scientific, less clinical, and it's got to end.
They found in Gaza this week a copy of Mein Kampf in Arabic being taught there. It speaks to the whole concept of education being central to this conflict, both between the Palestinians and Israel, and of course the West versus Israel as well.
It's stunning when you look not only at the copies of Mein Kampf, when you hear reports that I'm hearing from the territories that in the last 2-3 weeks, they've seen more swastikas up, more Nazi symbolization up. First of all, you see how Hamas, and I'm sorry to say, much of Palestinian political culture dips into the evil well of Nazism. And we really do need a denazification. But the greatest scandal here is who was paying for this education of 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds yelling, Itbachel Yehud, kill the Jews, slaughter the Jews. It was the UN through UNRWA. It was the lovely Canadians and the Norwegians and the Americans. The day after this conflict, the day after this war, there's going to have to be a reckoning in Israel. Let's acknowledge that. There's going to have to be a new set of protocols dealing with both Gaza and the territories. But the international community has to take some responsibility for the degree to which they, through goodwill, helped pay for, finance, and even conceptualize a kind of education which was really a form of child abuse, which led, and think about it, Hamas has been ruling the Gaza Strip for 16 years. 18 years ago in 2005 was the disengagement. In those 18 years and in those 16 years, many of the fighters, many of the killers, many of the rapists were raised on hate, a hate sponsored by the loveliest, nicest, most liberal forces in the world today. That's messed up. And it's partially a story of anti-Semitism, but it's partially a story of Western naivete and a failure of the West to recognize the evil out there. And once you can't recognize evil, you actually lose your appreciation for good. And that's part of the reason why Israelis, for all the suffering we're enduring, and I was so moved by that opening list of the 43 heroes, and so worried that the list is only going to grow and grow by these wonderful people. We suffer. We mourn. We know evil, but it also allows us to shed tears of joy, to smile, to delight, and to know what good is, because we recognize evil and we fight evil. And the best way to fight evil is by living well.
And Israelis know how to do that, most certainly. What about then the people who are marching with the leaders of the anti-Israel movement, who maybe feel like they have good intentions and just want to call to a ceasefire? What's the message to those people?
Let's separate out three things. First of all, I have zero tolerance for anybody who was unable on October 7th to condemn the systematic targeting of civilians. And it continues. So those people who say, as I was saying earlier, about decolonization and anything that happens is Israel's fault, even those, I'm starting to say, someone like President Barack Obama, who compared what he called unbearable nature of the occupation, and I have my criticism, but it's not the same kind of thing as what happened on October 7th, those people have lost moral authority, and those people are stuck in a sea of moral equivalence, and frankly, are supporting evil in the most incomprehensible, unconscionable way. That's one group of people. The second group of people, we can debate Israeli military tactics. We can debate whether or not to bomb or how one responds. But what we're seeing in so many of these demonstrations is another form of moral anarchy, another form of moral idiocy, because we go from I dislike this Israeli policy or this Israeli action to Israel doesn't have the right to exist. I dislike Israel itself and gas the Jews. That too is unacceptable. We have to be very careful, because even as we condemn the extremists, the fanatics, those whose souls have really withered, and by the way, I don't envy them. And I also, as a person who believes in free speech, I don't want to clamp them down, because I want people in Paris to see who is supporting evil. I want Harvard donors and Harvard parents and Harvard students to see the Harvard professors, the Harvard students, the Columbia professors who are supporting evil. So I don't want to clamp them down. I want to let them speak. I have faith that there are more decent people in the United States, in England, in France, than these indecent people. The third group, and not the moral idiots, and not the evil ones, but the morally confused ones. And now, unfortunately, anti-Israelism has become hip, has become a trend. And those are the people we really have to work on. And we have to be careful not to clump them in with the October 7th apologists and the Bash Israel Firsters, and try to have a conversation with them in which we ask the question, if you were attacked in Canada, nice Canada, in England, in the United States, this kind of systematic slaughter, this kind of systematic rape, this kind of systematic kidnapping, what would you do? How would you defend yourself? If you understand, as I said earlier, that your constitution, your basic form of government is not a suicide pact, how do you mobilize? Once you answer that question, then go historically and go on a journey with me and see how it was done in World War II, how it was done in fighting ISIS. And then if you understand that Hamas is ISIS, then explain to me what Israel's doing wrong and acknowledge what Israel's doing right. But to take this very complicated conflict and to speak about it in such simple terms should be a warning bell, an alarm bell, that no, we're not in the realm of thought, we're in the realm of propaganda. And that third group is the group we really have to be working with.
Absolutely. We're both here in Israel. Most of our audience is not. What's your message to diaspora Jews right now?
First of all, stay strong. I know it's been a very difficult time for many of my friends in the diaspora, but learn in some ways, not from our mistakes, but from our strengths. You know, when I hear that at Cornell University, for example, there was some threat on social media to stab the Jews, and then all of a sudden they shut down the kosher dining hall, I was embarrassed. Why didn't they invite the football team and the lacrosse team to the kosher dining hall, give them free steak, and say, we need your allyship, we need your friendship? But even more than that, how come Jews don't know how to stand up for themselves? Look at your 18 and 20 and 22-year-old cousins and heroes in Israel. Look at these 38 and 42-year-olds who are going from being principals of schools to fighting. Stand strong. So first is there has to be a Zionist revolution from within. And secondly, you have to reach out. There's a beautiful test. It's a beautiful win-win when you go to your non-Jewish friends and you say, by the way, anti-Semitism, it's not a Jewish issue. It's a non-Jewish problem. It's not a disease of the Jews. It's the disease of some non-Jews. And you turn to your non-Jewish friends and say, will you join me in the rally in Washington on Tuesday? It's a win-win. Either they join you and you're sometimes pleasantly surprised, or you discover who your true friends are. So first, I think there has to be a more creative, more angry, more out-of-the-box fight against anti-Semitism. And second is we in Israel, we need your help. We need your love. We need your support. This war has already cost over $50 billion is the estimate. There was $4 billion of damage done just on that one day on October 7th. This is an opportunity not just to write checks, but to open your hearts and to start thinking about how do I come and help rebuild the South? This can be a really exciting moment. As I said earlier, history sometimes bursts into your house and you can try to dodge it, or you can say, hey, wait a minute. This is a moment for me to stand up. This is a moment for me to think what's important to me. And this is a moment for me to use the pain in Israel, the trauma in Israel, the loss in Israel, the need to rebuild in Israel as a chance, as Zionism always taught, to build and be rebuilt. I know that's what's going on in Israel. I know so many young people who are fighting in the army now are already planning to go south and rebuild. And I want there to be new communities and rebuild communities. I want some of the new communities to be religious and non-religious people living together, working together, praying somewhat differently, but understanding how united we need to be. And I want those older communities, those hurting communities to rise again. And we have the opportunity, we have the human capital to do it. And I think it could be such an exciting story that it won't just inspire Israelis. It won't just inspire Jews, but it'll inspire non-Jews all over the world, like those cowboys from Montana who arrived in Israel just a few days ago.
I visited the stand with us office today, the cowboys
and
from Montana.
they're 7'20", but we love them, and their hearts are even bigger than their smiles and their 10-gallon hats.
And we appreciate them being here. You literally wrote the book on Zionism. I have it here. I think you signed it. Thank you very much. So at this time, specifically at this moment, why is Zionism so relevant to the Jewish people? And if it's hard to do, and everything is day by day right now, but let's look ahead. What does Israel and the Jewish people's relationship with Israel look like in 6 months, a year, 5 years' time?
We have to do what I call the jujitsu. Take the negative and turn it into a positive. October 7th was an awful, awful day. The bloodiest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, we keep on saying. That feeling that so many of us had, oh my goodness, what's happening there? I feel for those people. That's a peoplehood feeling, and that's an important feeling. But the second feeling that we had, which is, oh, how can I help? How am I going to push back? How am I going to fight? And how am I going to dream and rebuild? That's a Zionism feeling. That's Zionism. And so first of all, we have to name the feelings that we had and have and use them to frame the story and reframe the story. Our first response was to go to our trauma zone. We started using all kinds of metaphors about pogrom and Holocaust on October 7th. October 7.2 is saying, wait a minute. Within minutes, Israelis from all over the region were coming and fighting, sometimes on the kibbutzim and sometimes coming from hours away and on their way. And they saved Israel that day. And so there's a Zionist story there, not a Holocaust story, not a pogrom story, but a new chapter in Jewish history was written, a new chapter in Zionist history was written October 7.2, which was defending the state of Israel. And on that day, Israelis saved Israel. The government failed. The IDF failed temporarily. But the soldiers, the individuals, the citizens succeeded and won. That's 7.2. But to your big question, we're now in October 7.3. And October 7.3 is first winning the war and all of us supporting Israel to free the hostages, to degrade Hamas, and to teach the Palestinians a lesson that they should have learned in 2005. Hamas took over by 2007 and destroyed Gaza with Gazans' complicity. Gaza has a beautiful seacoast. It could have been the Riviera of the Mediterranean. They chose to make it Hamasistan. Let's try to reset it and give them an opportunity to rebuild. But for us, this is a moment for us to start dreaming again, for us to start thinking again, for us to start appreciating again, and for us to learn the lessons of these awful, awful days. When you're faced with Jewish history, staring you in the face, breathing down your neck, and we might be in the darkest, darkest days. We might be going down the darkest, darkest tunnels. And then you see these points of light. You see Rose Lubin, this 20-year-old from Atlanta, who just wanted to live her life here in Israel. And unfortunately, her life was cut short. But her memories inspired so many. Thousands of people came to her funeral. Tens of thousands are reading her story. When you see again and again these young, brave people running toward the fight, not running away from the fight, and then planning on rebuilding, you know that death cult that Hamas has developed is never going to defeat us. You know that the next chapter in Zionist history is being written right now by our young people who are going to make this country better, safer, freer, and they're going to make the world better, safer, freer by standing up to evil and creating a renewed Zionism, a renewed Israel that inspires not just Jews, but Westerners throughout the world who understand what democracy is, what lowercase l liberalism is, and what true Zionism is, which is a liberal democratic movement to allow Jews to be free in their home and as such be a model to the world.
Important and inspirational messages to take to heart. Thank you so much, Professor Gil Troy. Thank you for being with us.
And thank you for all you do.
Thank you.